Now, breathwork is, as we've been saying and experiencing, a wonderful thing, but there are times when not to do breathwork. If a client cannot have any positive thoughts about themselves, cannot have a loving intention towards themselves, then breathing is just going to breathe them into more negativity. If a person is going through extreme dysregulation, they are having a psychotic episode or so depressed that they can't move, then they're not in a position when they can actively benefit from breath work. Now, breathing is always good for everyone, because I don't know anyone that's died from breathing, but people often die from not breathing. But we're talking about actually doing a conscious breathwork session may not always be the thing. Sometimes there are physical limitations which would prohibit your doing certain kinds of breathwork. If a person has severe asthma, you may have to learn how to work with that. There's a buteyko breathing, for example, that helps people with asthma, but you should be aware of that, of not just putting a person in an asthma attack. There are other diseases of the physical passageways for breathing in the pulmonary vessels. And if a person describes something like that, you can still do some form of breathing, but not as vigorously. It's good to know what your scope of practice is, what you have familiarity with. If you're uncertain, then ask a supervisor or give that client to someone who has experience with that kind of disorder. Now, just as it's important for the client to be grounded and present enough to do breath work, it doesn't mean that they have to be perfect and all together. Of course, that's why they're coming, because they're not feeling great and all together, to be sure. But if they're so dysregulated that they cannot follow instructions or be grounded, then you have to start at another place until they get there. And finally, you have to be aware enough as a breath worker to know what you're comfortable in working with. If you find that something is too uncomfortable for you, forcing yourself into working with a client is not going to be useful for you or them. Well, there's so much that is before us to learn and grow together with. When we, for example, in part 2 of the breathwork training, we go into body reading themes so that you can recognize, just in looking at a person's body, some of what their history has been, some of what their limiting thoughts are about themselves, as well as what their special gifts are. Also in part 2, we're going to go much deeper into healing trauma with many, many different techniques that you can use when you're working with trauma. Also, we're going to work with groups and how to become comfortable with, if you're not already, working with breathwork in groups, both in person and online.